Should have stayed in your neighborhood. Those words would haunt Officer Scott Jeff for the rest of his life. Frederick Tucker climbed the courthouse steps with purpose, his navy suit crisp, his leather briefcase gripped in his right hand. Inside were depositions, witness statements, 11 months of work for Ramirez vs. Westfield Industries. Another one thinking he belongs here. Jeff glanced at his partner, Jones Sherman, and they both smirked. "This is a restricted area," Jeff said, blocking Tucker's path. His eyes raked over Tucker with open contempt. "I'm an attorney," Tucker replied calmly, reaching for his credentials. "I have a case." Jeff's hand shot out and grabbed Tucker's wrist, twisting it backward. "Don't move!" Sherman drove his shoulder into Tucker's ribs. The impact sent Tucker crashing down onto the marble steps. His briefcase flew from his grip, legal documents scattering like confetti across the courthouse steps. Jeff's knee slammed into Tucker's spine, pinning him face down. "Should have stayed in your neighborhood." Jeff twisted Tucker's arms behind his back, metal handcuffs biting into his wrists. "People like you don't belong in places like this." Sherman's boot connected with Tucker's fallen briefcase, sending it clattering down the steps. More papers scattered. Other officers emerged from the courthouse entrance, some chuckling, one recording the scene on his phone. Tucker's face pressed against the stone, blood trickling from his split lip. But his eyes stayed locked on the bronze plaque embedded in the courthouse wall 15 feet above him. Justice, through truth and equality. 20 feet from where he was supposed to be delivering opening arguments, being brutalized by the very system he'd spent his career trying to reform. Have you ever witnessed injustice flip this fast? Before we continue, write in the comment section where in the world you're watching from. And if you hate seeing people judged before being heard, please subscribe. The courthouse corridor stretched endlessly before Tucker, each step a new humiliation. Jeff's grip on his left arm was unnecessarily tight, fingers digging into muscle. Sherman walked on his right, hand resting on Tucker's shoulder, pushing him forward whenever he slowed. The handcuffs bit deeper with every movement. A young associate from Morrison and Hayes froze mid-stride, her coffee cup hovering near her lips. Her eyes went wide. "Is that—" "Keep moving!" Jeff barked at Tucker, shoving him harder. More heads turned. A senior partner Tucker had cross-examined last year stopped in the hallway, his mouth falling open. Two law clerks whispered urgently to each other, one pulling out her phone. Tucker heard fragments of conversations trailing behind him like debris. "That's Frederick Tucker, the civil rights lawyer. What happened? Oh my God." A clerk from Judge Brennan's chambers recognized him immediately. "Mr. Tucker? What?" She reached toward him instinctively. Sherman stepped between them. "Back away from the prisoner, ma'am." "Prisoner? He's an attorney. He has a case in—" "I said back away." Tucker caught her eye for just a moment. Her face was a mixture of confusion and horror. He wanted to tell her to call Judge Brennan, to explain, but Jeff yanked him forward before he could speak. They pushed through the double doors into courtroom 4B. Judge Harold Fisher sat behind the bench, reviewing documents with visible irritation. He was older, silver-haired, a visiting judge from the Northern District filling in while Judge Brennan handled an emergency motion in another courtroom. He glanced up as they entered, his expression souring further at the interruption. "Your Honor," Jeff said, his voice shifting to formal deference. "We apologize for the delay. We've apprehended a disruptive individual who assaulted officers while attempting to breach courthouse security." Fisher's eyes moved from Jeff to Tucker. He took in the torn suit, the bruised face, the handcuffs. His expression didn't soften. It hardened. Just another criminal. Another case to process before lunch. "Name?" Fisher asked, pen poised over his notepad. "He refused to provide identification, Your Honor," Sherman interjected smoothly. "Became violent when we asked." "I'm Frederick," Tucker started. "The defendant will remain silent until addressed by the court," Fisher snapped. He looked back at Jeff. Charges? Assault on a police officer, resisting arrest, and criminal trespass on federal property. Fisher wrote without looking up. Anything else? He was behaving erratically, Your Honor. We believe he may have been under the influence. Tucker's jaw clenched. Every word was a lie, each one more calculated than the last. He watched Fisher accept it all without question, watched the system work exactly as it was designed to work. Swift, efficient, unquestioning, when the defendant looked like him. Seat the defendant, Fisher ordered. Sherman and Jeff walked Tucker to the defendant's table and forced him into the chair. The metal handcuffs scraped against the wooden armrest. Tucker sat perfectly still, his torn suit jacket hanging awkwardly off one shoulder, blood dried at the corner of his mouth. His briefcase was somewhere on the courthouse steps. His credentials were in his jacket pocket, inches from his fingers, but he couldn't reach them. Fisher shuffled his papers, already moving to the next item on his docket, already convinced of Tucker's guilt, before a single word of testimony. The bailiff's station stood empty. Steve Gomez wasn't on duty yet. Officer Jeff, please take the stand. Jeff walked to the witness box with the confidence of a man who had done this 100 times before. He placed his right hand on the Bible, his left hand relaxed at his side. The oath rolled off his tongue like a prayer he'd memorized in childhood. His uniform was immaculate, every crease sharp, every button polished. He settled into the chair and folded his hands on the wooden rail, the picture of professional composure. Fisher looked at him expectantly. Officer, please tell the court what happened this morning. Jeff cleared his throat, his voice steady and measured. Your Honor, at approximately 9:47 a.m., my partner Officer Sherman and I were conducting routine security protocols at the courthouse entrance. We observed an individual. He gestured toward Tucker without looking directly at him, behaving suspiciously near the main steps. Tucker sat motionless at the defendant's table, his eyes locked on Jeff. His face remained calm, almost serene, but his jaw was tight enough to crack teeth. Can you describe this suspicious behavior? Fisher asked, pen moving across his notepad. Yes, Your Honor. The individual was pacing back and forth at the base of the steps, repeatedly looking over his shoulder, checking his surroundings. He appeared agitated, nervous. In my 6 years of experience, I've learned to recognize behavior patterns that indicate criminal intent. The lie flowed like water. Tucker had been walking straight up the steps, reviewing his notes, not a wasted movement. When we approached to conduct a standard security check, Jeff continued, we identified ourselves as police officers and politely asked for identification. The individual immediately became hostile. He raised his voice, used profanity, and refused to comply with our lawful request. Fisher nodded, writing faster now. I asked him again to identify himself and explain his business at the courthouse. That's when he became physically aggressive. Jeff paused, letting the moment breathe, letting the weight of the accusation settle over the courtroom. He shouted, I don't have to tell you anything, and threw a punch directly at Officer Sherman's chest. Tucker's fingers curled slowly against the armrest. Every muscle in his body wanted to stand, to object, to tear apart the fabrication word by word. But he remained still, patient, listening to every detail, cataloging every lie. Officer Sherman stumbled backward from the impact, Jeff said, his voice taking on a note of concern now, almost regret. I immediately moved to protect my partner and restrain the individual before he could cause further harm. He resisted violently, forcing us to use necessary physical force to bring him under control. Necessary physical force, Fisher repeated, underlining something on his notepad. Yes, Your Honor. We had no choice but to subdue him and place him under arrest for assault on a police officer, resisting arrest, and criminal trespass on federal property. The safety of courthouse staff and visitors was our primary concern. Jeff sat back slightly, his performance complete. His face showed just the right mixture of professionalism and subtle concern. a man who had done his difficult duty and wanted nothing more than to protect the public. Fisher studied his notes for a moment, then looked up at Jeff. "Officer, in your professional opinion, was the defendant under the influence of drugs or alcohol?" "It's possible, Your Honor. His behavior was certainly erratic and irrational." Another lie, another brick in the wall they were building around Tucker. Fisher made another note. "Thank you, Officer Jeff. You may step down." Jeff returned to his seat beside Sherman, and they exchanged the briefest glance. A job well done. The system was working exactly as they needed it to work. Tucker's eyes never left them. His face remained calm, but behind that calm was the mind of an attorney who had spent 11 years dismantling lies in courtrooms just like this one. "Officer Sherman, please take the stand." Jones Sherman rose with the same practiced confidence as his partner, his movements deliberate and professional. He placed his hand on the Bible, recited the oath, and settled into the witness chair. His uniform was equally pristine, his posture military straight. He looked directly at Fisher, ignoring Tucker completely. "Officer Sherman," Fisher began, "can you corroborate Officer Jeff's account of this morning's events?" "Yes, Your Honor, every word." Sherman's voice was firm, certain. "My partner and I were conducting our assigned security detail when we observed the defendant acting suspiciously. His behavior immediately raised red flags, pacing, looking around nervously, displaying signs of agitation. In the gallery behind the prosecution table, 3 other officers in uniform sat watching. One nodded slowly as Sherman spoke. Another whispered something to his colleague. "When we approached him," Sherman continued, "we were professional and courteous. We simply asked him to identify himself and state his business at the courthouse, standard procedure. But instead of complying, he became verbally abusive and physically threatening." Fisher's pen moved steadily across his notepad. Sherman leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping into a more personal register. "Your Honor, I've been a police officer for 7 years. I've dealt with countless hostile situations. But when that man threw a punch at me," he paused, placing his hand over his chest, "I feared for my safety. He was irrational, violent. We've been extensively trained to recognize genuine threats, and this individual was clearly dangerous." The officers in the gallery nodded again. One folded his arms, his expression grave and supportive. The choreography was perfect, every gesture reinforcing the narrative. "His fist connected with my chest," Sherman said, his voice carrying just enough emotion to sound authentic without seeming theatrical. "If Officer Jeff hadn't intervened when he did, I don't know what would have happened. This man was out of control." Tucker's breathing remained steady, but his knuckles had gone white against the armrest. He watched Sherman perform, watched the judge absorb every word, watched the machine operate with mechanical precision. "We had no choice but to subdue him," Sherman concluded. "Public safety demanded it. The safety of everyone in this courthouse demanded it." Fisher nodded, making a final note. "Thank you, Officer Sherman." He looked up at Tucker for the first time since the hearing began. His eyes were cold, already convinced. "Does the defendant have anything to say?" The courtroom went quiet. Jeff and Sherman exchanged a glance. Subtle, confident. This was the moment defendants usually broke down, usually confessed, usually made it even easier. Tucker stood slowly, the handcuffs rattling against the table. He straightened his torn jacket as much as he could manage. When he spoke, his voice was calm, controlled, every word precise. "Not yet, Your Honor." Fisher frowned. "Not yet? But I would like to make a request." Tucker's eyes moved deliberately from Fisher to Jeff to Sherman and back. "I'd like to preserve all security footage from the courthouse steps between 9:30 and 10 o'clock a.m. this morning. I'd also like to preserve all body camera footage from both Officer Jeff and Officer Sherman during that same time period." The confidence drained from Sherman's face. Jeff's jaw tightened visibly. Fisher looked genuinely surprised. That's an unusual request from a defendant. Nevertheless, Your Honor, I'm making it. For the record. Fisher studied Tucker for a long moment, seeing him clearly for the first time. The calm demeanor, the precise legal language, the strategic thinking. Something shifted in the judge's expression. Not quite doubt, but the first seed of curiosity. Very well, Fisher said slowly. Bailiff, make a note to preserve all relevant security and body camera footage as requested. He paused. Anything else? Not at this time, Your Honor. Tucker sat back down, his eyes returning to the two officers. Neither of them was smiling anymore. What happens next is exactly why this channel exists. If these stories matter to you, please subscribe. The side door to the courtroom opened with a soft click. Bailiff Steve Gomez stepped through, a stack of case files balanced in his arms, his attention focused on the papers clipped to his board. He'd worked this courthouse for 15 years. He could navigate these rooms blindfolded. Judge Brennan's morning docket was packed, and he was already running behind after dealing with a security issue downstairs. Your Honor, I apologize for the delay, Gomez said, not looking up. Judge Brennan asked me to... He glanced toward the bench, then automatically scanned the room as he always did. Defense table. Prosecution. Gallery. His eyes landed on the defendant's table, and everything stopped. The clipboard slipped from his hands. It hit the floor with a crack that echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. Case files scattered across the tile. Papers slid under the gallery benches. Every head in the courtroom turned toward him. Gomez stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, staring at the man in handcuffs sitting at the defendant's table. The torn suit, the bruised face, the blood at the corner of his mouth, the absolute stillness of someone who had learned to control every muscle, every reaction. Steve? Fisher's voice cut through the silence. Are you all right? Gomez didn't respond. He couldn't. His eyes moved from Tucker to Officers Jeff and Sherman, then back to Tucker. His face had gone completely white. When he tried to speak, nothing came out at first, just a strangled sound in the back of his throat. That's... His voice was barely a whisper, so quiet that people in the gallery leaned forward to hear. That's Frederick Tucker. Fisher frowned, irritation creeping into his voice. Who? But Gomez wasn't looking at Fisher anymore. He was staring at Tucker with an expression of absolute horror, like he was witnessing a car crash in slow motion and couldn't look away. His hands were trembling. Frederick Tucker, Gomez repeated, his voice growing stronger now, shaking with disbelief. He pointed at Tucker, his finger unsteady. That's Frederick Tucker, civil rights attorney. The courtroom went absolutely silent. Even the officers in the gallery stopped whispering. He's supposed to be in this courtroom in 20 minutes, Gomez continued, his words tumbling out faster now. He's the lead counsel on Ramirez versus Westfield. Judge Brennan's been preparing for this case for 3 weeks. It's on the docket. He looked down at the scattered papers on the floor, then back up at Tucker. It's right here on the morning schedule. Fisher's pen stopped moving. His face went from irritated to confused to something approaching alarm in the span of 3 seconds. I'm sorry. Did you say attorney? Yes, Your Honor. Gomez's voice was steady now, but his face was still pale. Frederick Tucker, one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in the state. He's argued cases in front of the Supreme Court. Gomez looked at Jeff and Sherman, and his expression changed to something darker. What did you do? Jeff's confident posture had evaporated. He sat rigidly in his chair, his face carefully neutral, but a thin line of sweat had appeared on his forehead. Sherman had gone completely still beside him, like a prey animal that had just realized it was surrounded. Fisher slowly set down his pen. He looked at Tucker, really looked at him this time. The expensive suit, even torn, the intelligent eyes. The posture of someone who knew exactly how courtrooms worked because he practically lived in them. "Is this true?" Fisher's voice had lost all its certainty. "Are you Frederick Tucker?" Tucker met his eyes calmly. "Yes, Your Honor, I am." The silence that followed was deafening. In the gallery, one of the supporting officers stood abruptly and walked toward the exit. Another pulled out his phone, texting rapidly. The third just stared straight ahead, his face frozen in disbelief. Jeff and Sherman sat like statues, their carefully constructed story crumbling around them. The courtroom erupted. Voices overlapped in urgent whispers. The remaining officers in the gallery leaned toward each other, their faces twisted in shock. A court clerk near the back stood up, her hand covering her mouth. Someone's phone buzzed repeatedly. News was already spreading through the courthouse like wildfire. Fisher's face had gone from pale to ashen. His eyes darted between Tucker and the two officers, then back to Tucker, as if trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he'd just been told. The implications were hitting him in waves, each one worse than the last. Tucker waited. Let the chaos build. Let the realization settle into every corner of the room. Then he stood slowly, the handcuffs rattling against the wooden table. The sound cut through the noise like a knife. The courtroom fell silent. "Your Honor," Tucker said, his voice calm and measured, carrying the weight of a man who had spent a decade commanding courtrooms just like this one. "I'd like to address the court." Fisher nodded mutely, unable to find words. Tucker straightened as much as he could with his hands cuffed behind his back. His torn jacket hung awkwardly off his shoulder. Blood had dried at the corner of his mouth. The bruise on his cheek had darkened to deep purple. But his voice was steady, professional, controlled. "My name is Frederick Tucker. I am a licensed attorney in the state of New York and a member of the federal bar." Each word was precise, deliberate. "I was attempting to enter this courthouse this morning at approximately 9:45 a.m. to represent my client, Maria Ramirez, in a discrimination case scheduled for 10:30 a.m. in this very courtroom." Fisher's hand moved unconsciously to his forehead. "I was walking up the courthouse steps," Tucker continued, his eyes never leaving Fisher's face. "I was reviewing my notes for my opening statement. I was not pacing. I was not agitated. I was not looking around nervously. I was doing exactly what every attorney in this building does before a major case, preparing." In the gallery, a junior attorney was frantically typing on her phone. Another had pulled up Tucker's name on a legal database, her screen showing a list of high-profile cases that scrolled down for pages. "Officers Jeff and Sherman intercepted me at the top of the steps," Tucker said. "Before I could produce my credentials, before I could identify myself, Officer Jeff grabbed my wrist. Officer Sherman tackled me to the ground. I was assaulted, handcuffed, and publicly humiliated on the steps of the courthouse where I have practiced law for 11 years. Jeff's jaw was clenched so tight it looked like it might shatter. Sherman stared straight ahead, his face drained of all color. Tucker turned slowly to face them, the handcuffs forcing him to move his entire body. "I was then dragged through this courthouse, marched into this courtroom, and forced to sit silently while these two officers stood before you and committed perjury." His voice remained calm, but the words landed like hammer blows. Every single word they spoke was a lie. He looked back at Fisher. "I did not pace nervously. I did not refuse to identify myself. I did not become hostile. I did not throw a punch at Officer Sherman. I did not resist arrest." Tucker paused, letting each statement hang in the air. "What I did do was attempt to enter my place of work while being a black man in a suit. And for that, I was brutalized." The silence that followed was suffocating. No one moved. No one breathed. "I was dragged in here," Tucker said quietly, "based on nothing but the color of my skin. And these officers—" He gestured with his shoulder toward Jeff and Sherman. fabricated an entire story under oath to justify what they did to me on those steps. Fisher's hands were shaking as he reached for his gavel. "Remove those handcuffs, now!" Fisher's voice cracked with urgency. Bailiff Gomez moved immediately, crossing to Tucker with keys already in hand. His fingers fumbled with the lock, once, twice, before the cuffs finally clicked open. Tucker brought his hands forward slowly, rubbing his wrists where the metal had left deep red marks in his skin. "Mr. Tucker," Fisher began, his voice unsteady. Your Honor, if I may." Tucker reached into his inner jacket pocket, the movement careful and deliberate. He produced a slim leather wallet and flipped it open. His bar card, laminated and official, sat in the front slot. Beneath it, his attorney identification card with the state seal, both still intact despite being tackled to marble steps. He placed them on the defense table where everyone could see. Fisher leaned forward, squinting at the cards from the bench. His face somehow went even paler. "I also have this," Tucker said, reaching into his other pocket. He pulled out his cell phone, the screen cracked but still functional. "Officers Jeff and Sherman failed to confiscate my phone when they arrested me. I'm not sure if that was incompetence or arrogance." Jeff's face flushed red. Sherman's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. Tucker turned to face Fisher directly. "Your Honor, a bystander on the courthouse steps filmed the entire incident. With your permission, I'd like to present that footage to the court." Fisher nodded mutely, unable to form words. Gomez rushed to help Tucker connect the phone to the courtroom's display system. The large screen on the side wall flickered to life, bright white, then filled with a slightly shaky video image of the courthouse steps. The timestamp in the corner read 9:46 a.m. Tucker pressed play. The courtroom watched in absolute silence. The footage showed Tucker climbing the steps with calm, purposeful strides, his briefcase in hand, his head slightly bowed as he reviewed a document. No pacing, no nervous glances, just a man walking to work. Then Jeff and Sherman appeared in frame, moving to intercept him. Tucker looked up, his expression polite, open. His mouth moved, words the camera couldn't capture, but his body language was clear, professional, non-threatening, explaining himself. Jeff's hand shot out, grabbing Tucker's wrist. Tucker's face registered surprise, confusion. His free hand moved toward his jacket pocket, reaching for his credentials. Sherman's shoulder drove into Tucker's ribs. The tackle was brutal, unwarranted, shocking in its violence. Tucker's briefcase flew through the air, papers exploding outward like a flock of startled birds. A woman in the gallery gasped. Someone else whispered, "Oh my God." The camera shook as the bystander moved closer, zooming in. Tucker's face pressed against the marble, Jeff's knee grinding into his spine. Tucker's mouth was moving. "I'm an attorney. I have credentials." But Jeff wasn't listening. His lips formed words the microphone barely caught. "Should have stayed in your neighborhood." Sherman's boot kicked the briefcase. Papers scattered. Other officers appeared, laughing. One pulled out his phone to record. Jeff wrenched Tucker's arms back, the handcuffs snapping closed. Tucker's face showed pain, humiliation, but also something else, a cold, calculating focus that said he was memorizing every detail. The video ended. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. No one moved. No one even seemed to breathe. Fisher sat frozen, his face a mask of horror. His eyes moved slowly from the screen to Tucker to Jeff and Sherman. The judge's hands gripped the edge of his bench, knuckles white. One of the court clerks was crying quietly in the corner. The junior attorney in the gallery had stopped typing. Her face was pale, her phone hanging forgotten in her hand. Jeff stared at his own hands. Sherman looked like he might be sick. Tucker stood calmly beside the defense table, his cracked phone still connected to the display system, his torn suit jacket hanging off his shoulder, and waited. He'd presented his evidence. Now he would let it speak for itself. Fisher finally found his voice. It came out as barely more than a whisper. "Dear God, What have you done? Tucker turned slowly to face Officers Jeff and Sherman. They sat rigid in their chairs, both men visibly sweating now despite the courthouse air conditioning. Jeff's collar had a dark ring of moisture. Sherman's hands were clenched so tightly in his lap that his knuckles had gone white. "Officers," Tucker said, his voice still calm, still measured, but carrying an edge now that cut through the silence like a blade. "You testified under oath, that I behaved suspiciously near the courthouse entrance. The video shows I walked directly up the steps reviewing my case notes." He took a step toward them. Neither man could meet his eyes. "You testified that I refused to identify myself. The video shows I was reaching for my credentials when Officer Jeff grabbed my wrist." Another step. "You testified that I became aggressive and struck Officer Sherman in the chest. The video shows Officer Sherman tackled me without provocation, without warning, without cause." Tucker's voice rose slightly, just enough to fill every corner of the courtroom. "You stood in this courtroom, placed your hands on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and then proceeded to lie. You committed perjury, both of you, in front of this court, in front of these witnesses, on the record." Sherman's face had gone gray. Jeff stared at the table in front of him, his jaw working soundlessly. Tucker turned back to Fisher. "Your Honor, I'd like to request access to these officers' personnel files, specifically any complaints or disciplinary actions related to racial profiling, excessive force, or misconduct." Fisher didn't hesitate. "Granted. Bailiff, get those files immediately." Gomez practically ran from the courtroom. Court staff were already moving, phones to their ears, calling down to records. The urgency was palpable. Everyone understood they were witnessing something catastrophic unfold in real time. The wait felt eternal, though it could only have been 3 or 4 minutes. The courtroom remained silent except for scattered whispers. Jeff and Sherman sat frozen, neither moving, neither speaking. They knew what was coming. Gomez burst back through the door, 2 thick manila folders in his hands. He placed them on Tucker's table with a heavy thump that echoed through the room. Tucker opened the first folder. His eyes scanned the pages, his expression never changing, though anyone watching carefully would have seen his jaw tighten incrementally with each page he turned. "Your Honor," Tucker said, looking up. "Officer Scott Jeff. 23 formal complaints of excessive force filed over a 6-year career. 18 of those complaints involve minorities, 15 black individuals, 3 Latino individuals, 2 formal reprimands, no suspensions, no meaningful disciplinary action." He opened the second folder. "Officer Jones Sherman. 17 formal complaints of excessive force over 7 years. 14 involve minorities, 11 black individuals, 3 Latino individuals. 1 formal reprimand. Again, no suspensions, no meaningful consequences." Tucker closed both folders and looked directly at Fisher. "These 2 officers, working as partners, have a combined arrest rate of 91% black and Latino individuals, despite working in a jurisdiction where minorities represent only 38% of the population." The numbers hung in the air like an indictment. "This isn't an isolated incident, Your Honor. This is a pattern, a documented systemic pattern of racial profiling, excessive force, and abuse of power. And when they're caught, when they're called to account, they lie under oath to protect themselves." Fisher's face had gone from pale to flushed, anger replacing shock. His hands gripped the gavel so hard it trembled. In the gallery, the remaining officer stood abruptly and left without a word. The door swung shut behind him with a final damning click. Jeff and Sherman sat in their chairs like condemned men waiting for the executioner. The courtroom doors exploded inward with enough force to slam against the walls. Every head whipped toward the entrance. Judge Patricia Brennan strode through, still wearing her overcoat, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor like gunshots. Her clerk had caught her between courtrooms, breathless and panicked, stammering something about Frederick Tucker being arrested in her courtroom. She'd dropped everything and run. What in God's name is happening in my courtroom? Her voice cut through the space with the authority of someone who had presided over federal cases for 23 years. Her eyes swept the room, taking in the scene with the rapid assessment of a veteran judge who'd seen every kind of courthouse drama imaginable. But nothing had prepared her for this. Fisher stood awkwardly, his face still flushed. Judge Brennan, I can explain. Then explain. Now. She was already moving toward the bench, her coat billowing behind her. Fisher's words tumbled out in a rush. Officers Jeff and Sherman brought in a defendant for assault and trespass. They testified under oath, but then Bailiff Gomez identified him as Frederick Tucker and... He gestured helplessly at the frozen video still displayed on the screen. Judge Brennan's eyes landed on Tucker. Her star attorney for Ramirez v. Westfield, the case she'd spent 3 weeks reviewing, the discrimination lawsuit that was supposed to start in, she glanced at her watch, 17 minutes. He stood by the defense table in a torn suit, handcuff marks on his wrists, a bruise darkening his cheek, blood dried at the corner of his mouth. Her face went absolutely still. Her gaze moved to officers Jeff and Sherman. They looked like cornered animals, sweating, pale, trapped. Then to the video on the screen, frozen on the image of Jeff's knee planted in Tucker's back, papers scattered across the courthouse steps. Her eyes moved back to Tucker. Mr. Tucker, are you all right? I've been better, Your Honor. I imagine you have. Her voice was ice. She turned to Fisher. Play the video. Your Honor, I've already... Play it again. Fisher nodded to Gomez, who restarted the footage. Judge Brennan watched in complete silence, her face growing harder with each passing second. The tackle, the knee, the scattered papers, the racial slur captured faintly on audio, the laughing officers, the brutality of it. When it ended, she didn't speak immediately. The silence stretched so long that people began shifting uncomfortably in their seats. When Judge Brennan finally spoke, her voice was quiet, dangerously quiet. Officers Jeff and Sherman, stand up. They rose slowly, shakily, both men looking like they might collapse. You arrested an attorney. You assaulted an attorney. You dragged an attorney into this courtroom and committed perjury to cover your crimes. Each word fell like a hammer blow. You violated his civil rights. You violated your oaths. You violated every principle this courthouse stands for. Her voice rose. Bailiff Gomez. Yes, Your Honor. Place officers Scott, Jeff, and Jones Sherman under arrest. Immediate arrest. Charges are perjury, assault, battery, false imprisonment, and violation of civil rights under color of law, right now. Gomez moved with swift efficiency, pulling his own handcuffs from his belt. He grabbed Jeff first, yanking his arms behind his back. The metallic click echoed through the silent courtroom. Wait! Your Honor, please! Jeff's voice cracked with desperation. We were just doing our jobs! Your job is not to assault innocent people. Judge Brennan's voice was steel. Your job is not to lie under oath. Your job is not to terrorize members of this bar because of the color of their skin. Gomez moved to Sherman, cuffing him with the same swift precision. Sherman didn't protest, didn't speak. He just stared at the floor, his face completely drained of color. Take them out of my courtroom, Judge Brennan ordered. Hold them for the U.S. Attorney. And someone call the FBI. This is now a federal civil rights investigation. Gomez marched both officers toward the door, their heads bowed, their careers ending with each step. The courtroom doors closed behind Jeff and Sherman with a hollow finality. Judge Brennan stood at the bench, her hands pressed flat against the wood, taking a moment to compose herself. When she looked up at Tucker, her expression had softened slightly, though the anger still simmered beneath. Mr. Tucker, on behalf of this court, I apologize. Her voice was formal but carried genuine remorse. What happened to you this morning was unconscionable. All charges against you are dismissed with prejudice. There will be no record of this arrest. The court will expunge every document, every filing, every reference to these false charges. Thank you, Your Honor. Additionally, I'm holding both officers in criminal contempt of this court. The matter is being referred immediately to the U.S. Attorney for federal prosecution. She paused. I'll be providing my personal testimony if required. Tucker nodded once, his face still calm despite everything. Judge Brennan glanced at her watch. Mr. Tucker, we have a case scheduled to begin in... She winced. 14 minutes. If you need time, if you need to postpone... No, Your Honor. Tucker straightened his torn jacket. Maria Ramirez has waited long enough for justice. I'm ready to proceed. Something flickered in Judge Brennan's eyes. Respect, perhaps. Or recognition that she was witnessing something remarkable. Very well. Court will reconvene at 10:30. 30 minutes later, Frederick Tucker stood before the jury box, his suit jacket borrowed from a colleague, his bruised face impossible to miss. He began his opening statement not with legal theory or corporate statistics, but with a story about walking up courthouse steps that morning, confident in his purpose, prepared for his work, and being brutalized for the crime of existing while black. My client, Maria Ramirez, knows what it feels like to be judged not by her merit, but by her appearance, Tucker said, his voice resonating through the courtroom. To be dismissed, diminished, denied opportunity because of who she is rather than what she can do. This morning I learned that lesson again myself. The jury was transfixed. Several were crying by the time he finished. The verdict came back 3 days later, $4.7 million in damages for Maria Ramirez. Complete vindication. The months that followed brought a reckoning that shook the entire department. Officers Jeff and Sherman went to federal trial, where Tucker testified with the same calm precision he'd shown in Judge Brennan's courtroom. Jeff received 8 years. Sherman received 6. Both were stripped of their pensions, their badges, their futures. But the investigation didn't stop there. The FBI uncovered a network of coordinated racist policing involving 12 additional officers, shared tactics, group chats where they mocked their victims, a culture of impunity that had festered for years. The entire department was placed under federal consent decree, subject to oversight, monitoring, mandatory reforms. Tucker filed his own landmark civil rights lawsuit. The settlement, $12 million, and sweeping institutional changes. Body cameras became mandatory. An independent civilian oversight board was established with real investigative authority. Bias training became annual, not optional. Officers with patterns of complaints faced automatic review. The courthouse steps where Frederick Tucker had been forced to his knees became something more than marble and stone. Protesters gathered there, holding signs, demanding change. Civil rights groups held vigils. Law students studied what happened there as a cautionary tale about power and accountability. Eventually, the city installed a memorial plaque on the wall where Tucker's face had been pressed against the stone. It read, "Here, injustice was met with truth. May we never forget that the law must serve all equally." Tucker's career reached heights he'd never imagined. He argued before the Supreme Court twice more. He trained a generation of civil rights attorneys. He became the name people invoked when they needed someone to fight the impossible fight. But late at night, in the quiet of his office, he would sometimes close his eyes and feel the weight of that knee pressing into his spine. He would hear the sound of his briefcase hitting marble, papers scattering, his life's work floating away on the morning breeze. He would remember the helplessness, the rage, the determination that had crystallized in that moment on the steps. Justice, even for those who spent their lives fighting for it, was never guaranteed. It required vigilance. It required courage. It required people willing to stand up even when forced to their knees, and Frederick Tucker would never stop standing.